Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, invasive plants and wildfires in southern Arizona. The problem with invasive plant species in southern Arizona is not new. It started with early ranchers and miners who brought plants they thought would make their work easier, and moved to recent population booms where people brought their favorite decorative plants from where they lived before. Those non-native plants all have the ability to leave the confines where humans hope to keep them and move into the natural ecosystem. And some have. To learn more about the problem, we took a short hike in Saguaro National Park East with park biologist Frankie Foley.
So this area, back in here, was all full of buffalo grass just a couple of weeks ago. And you can see these little flowers that are popping up. They're called erigeron.
The little white ones?
Yeah, they weren't there not that long ago. And you can see the pile of the old buffalo grass that was dug up. That's all grayed out on that rock. So all of this was filled in. And now it's popping up with a bunch of native wildflowers, which is so amazing.
I was going to say, so volunteers out here pulled the buffalo grass, and right away we're seeing what is supposed to be happening.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's what I think is so encouraging to see those before, after, and then a couple of months after photos of the dig areas. It's stunning. I took some photos recently over on the west side where we had a volunteer event in December. So I took those before photo, and it was just all buffalo grass with a couple of trees and people digging really hard work. And then at the end of the day, I took another photo, and it was really cleared out. And then just about 2 weeks ago, I went back and I took a photo, and it's just filled in with wildflowers. Just so beautiful.
So you mentioned the buffalo grass, the dead buffalo grass that's been piled up here on some rocks and is all grayed out. So you don't necessarily have to, after you pull it out of the ground, you don't necessarily have to pull it out of the environment. You can just let it break down, and anything that needs to use it for nesting or whatever, go ahead.
Yeah, we've done a bunch of studies throughout the years of managing buffalo grass in southern Arizona, and we've determined that our best strategy here is to try to make piles of the dead buffalo grass and do our best to fold in the seeds so that they're less likely to blow around, and we just place a couple of rocks on top just to really hold it all in tightly together. That way it removes a lot of the biomass, and it creates that open space for those wildflowers to pop up exactly as they have.
Any fire concern with just the piles of buffalo grass? Because it does burn so well.
Mm-hmm. It sure does burn well. Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that we ask quite a bit ourselves. And there have been studies, and there's some research that has been done to highlight the decrease in flammability of the buffalo grass biomass throughout time. And it doesn't decrease to zero. So, there is a concern with that. But I think the thing that we try to think about is that connectivity of fuel. And so, again, we tend to have a lot of bare ground and open space in the desert, and the buffalo grass really fills in that bare ground and open space, and it creates a fuel line. So once we do remove that, it's that connectivity is really limited when we do make those piles.
So buffalo grass is the big one. Everybody talks about it, but now we're hearing about things like stink net. What else is out here, unfortunately, in the park?
Yeah, there are quite a few invasive plants here in the park and in the surrounding landscape. Buffalo grass is a non-native invasive perennial bunch grass, which that's a lot of jargon for you. But bunch grass really paints the picture, right? So it grows in this big bunch, and perennial means it is long-lived. It lives year after year. There are other non-native perennial bunch grasses that are in the park and in the forest and public lands all around us and in town as well. They don't tend to have the biomass that buffalo grass does have. There's another species called fountain grass that does have that biomass, like a lot of fuel above ground. Fountain grass is an ornamental plant, unfortunately, so it's really pretty, and that's been to our detriment here in the park. It has done a wonderful job of filling in drainages, like the one that we're standing in. We've had quite a project underway for the last several years of digging out and spraying with herbicide fountain grass specifically to clear out our drainages. We know how valuable and important water is in the desert. And invasive plants that fill in the drainages are taking up that water that is so scarce and important to all the other species that are out here.
What about our new friend stinknet that everybody's just started talking about down here?
Yes, stinknet. So it's funny, our climate is somewhat similar to that of Southern Africa because bufflegrass is from Southern Africa and stinknet is as well. And so, yeah, here in Pima County, I personally have been fighting stinknet for the past 5 or so years in Pima County. Last year was when we really noticed up in Maricopa County stinknet totally taking over the landscape. And it was a big panic that all of us were really concerned about how it might impact us downstream or really down the freeway here in Pima County. And it's popping up quite a bit in town. We've found it much more so on the west side of the park, the Western District, but we are finding it here in fairly isolated locations on the Eastern District of the park.
Is it something that, unlike bufflegrass, it seems like bufflegrass is here to stay, it's more of a management thing, can we get ahead of stinknet? Is it still early enough, or has that ship also sailed?
It's hopefully still early enough. I think we have a really great working group that is trying to collect as much data as possible about the infestation this year. I think something that is really interesting to think about, that we had so much winter rain, right? And so the stinknet seed that was in the ground very likely was viable and germinated and popped up. And so we're seeing a lot of stinknet. But the good news is, in my mind, is that perhaps we're depleting that seed source in the soil. And so if we get ahead of it and really make a lot of strides this year and removing the plants that are coming up and preventing further seed from being deposited into the soil. So it's tough. It's definitely a hard situation to be in. I know a lot of folks feel really discouraged to see what's going on in Maricopa County, and now we're seeing it pop up in sizable populations here in town. But the working group is definitely not ready to throw in the towel by any means, and we're doing everything we can to, like I said, collect data on the infestations. So we've been asking everybody to go to stinknet.org. and report any populations that they might find of stinknet using a smartphone. And you can actually do that from your computer as well if you're not in a location. But the problem is you have to upload a photo. So if you can take a photo, that would be really beneficial. And the reason that they, really request that photo is a lot of people misidentify the plants. And so, it's really helpful to be able to weed those out.
Talking about misidentifying, someone's in the park, they see stinknet. Maybe it's stinknet, maybe it isn't. I know the rules in the park, having been to so many parks and spending a lot of time in the western unit of Saguaro, is don't take anything with you when you leave. But if someone sees stinknet, do you want them to pull it up or just treat it like everything else in the park, leave it alone and report it?
For this year specifically, I definitely want them to just report it. That has been really helpful for us. And especially with that data, we know that the seed source that is in the soil, maybe most of them, germinated this year with all the rain that we got, but we want to be certain that we're getting rid of all of that seed. So if we have it mapped, we are continuing to go back to these locations year after year. I mean, on a bi-weekly pattern, really, to known infestations. So just reporting it for now would be good.
Stinknet, is becoming part of, unfortunately, the wildflower bloom. Everybody loves the wildflowers here. They're amazing. The spot where we're standing, we can see lots of different ones. Why is stinknet bad?
Yeah, if you were to see some of the photos of really bad infestations, you will see a landscape of pure yellow. And yes, it might superficially look pretty to a certain eye. But, something that we love so much about springtime in the desert is the wildflower bloom. And we love seeing the diversity of species, the colors, the pollinators are here. And it is just such a season of excitement with infestations of stinknet crowding out these native species and decreasing the biodiversity of the landscape. We definitely will suffer less of a experience of our summer or spring rather wildflower blooms. So, looking at the landscape, we see all the diversity. I know that can very easily get diminished if stinknet were to take over the landscape. And another thing about stinknet that is really detrimental, aside from decreasing the biodiversity and the wildflowers and taking over the landscape, is the fire risk associated with stinknet. Stinknet in particular, when it dries out, it'll be doing that in the next month or so as things heat up and dry out on the landscape. It is really, really highly flammable. And so as it fills in, similar to bufflegrass, those open spaces, it can carry fuel and carry fire for quite a distance. And we know that the native desert plants are just not adapted to survive and withstand the effects of wildfire.
No, mountain fires, the pines and things are used to it. Some of them need it, but yeah, down here on the floor, we don't need fire.
Yeah, there was a fire in 2020 called the Aguila fire. That fire was carried largely by stinknet. And speaking with wildland firefighters that were on that fire, they reported that the smoke was just so toxic and caustic that it gave them respiratory problems. And that is something that we're also seeing in populations that are living near or working in stinknet, infestations. People report dermatitis, skin reactions. I personally, my nose starts running like crazy when I'm pulling it. People get headaches really easily and just have, respiratory problems as well. So it's really a nasty plant.
And thus the name.
Yeah.
I should have asked about that. How did it get a name? You don't usually hear flowers called stink.
Well, it really stinks. I mean, if you touch one, you'll know exactly why they call it stinknet. It actually did used to have a different common name called globe chamomile, and that sounds really lovely. And people like
sounds like
chamomile.
a tea.
Exactly,
yes.
Yeah. And we needed to do a rebranding effort on that one because we did not want people to think that it was a welcome species.
All right. Well, thanks for taking a walk through Saguaro East with us.
Thank you.
That was Frankie Foley, a biologist with Saguaro National Park. Non-native plants are routinely spotted in areas that go beyond the lands we've set aside for human development, such as national parks. Ben Tully is an invasive species outreach educator with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. I started by asking him why we're concerned with invasive plants in the desert.
Well, there are a few different things. The first is the potential to really disrupt the ecosystem. The Sonoran Desert ecosystem is not evolved to fire, so fires here are, just not supposed to happen. Extremely damaging to the native plants and animals. Whereas these invasive species, the main ones we're concerned about, which are bufflegrass, fountain grass, and stinknet, they all come from a part of Africa where fires are part of the life cycle. They're natural. It's evolved to manage to fires be, part of the natural cycle. So when those plants come in here, they will thrive off the fire, and our natives will not, and the habitat will be, potentially transformed from, saguaro vistas into a grassland. That's one of the big concerns. And of course, on a more basic level, fire and the urban sprawl and damaging people's homes and affecting tourism. The most recent one to arrive here of those big three, which is stinknet, that one causes a lot of allergies as well, in addition to the other things I said, outcompeting plants and transforming the scenery.
Before we get to stinknet, because it is that time of year where we talk about stinknet, before we did this interview, we were chatting in the newsroom about all of this, and someone brought up fountain grass, and I think that's the one that everybody forgets. I know I forget. We all hear about bufflegrass. We all hear about stinknet, and as they said, as you drive up Mount Lemmon here in Tucson, it's up high. It's not necessarily low. Is this the one that gets forgotten, or is it just me?
No, I think it often does, and it looks very pretty in landscapes, and that's why it was brought here as an ornamental, and I think because people are used to seeing it, maybe it's been used for a long time in this way in yards, it doesn't seem to be a problem, but it really is. I mean, it's a cousin of bufflegrass. It doesn't spread quite so rapidly as bufflegrass does, but close to it, and fire threat, all those things. So yeah, fountain grass definitely does not get as much attention as bufflegrass, but a lot of field guides for bufflegrass will just have a few pages about fountain grass because most of the characteristics are the same.
You mentioned fountain grass was brought here as an ornamental. Is that how buffalo grass got here, how stinknet got here? Is that how most of the invasives are getting here, or is there a climate change issue or just some sort of almost natural spread?
All three of those actually got here in different ways. Buffalo grass was brought in for erosion control and grazing as agriculture was booming. About 100 years ago, the 20s and 30s, the USDA found this wonder grass, buffalo grass in Africa, and thought, oh, that'll help with, stabilizing the soil in farms and mines, as well as feeding the cattle, and did not think about the repercussions, did not think about how it would outcompete natives in it being flammable. And then stinknet is unknown. It's like a stowaway on a boat or something. It was first seen in California, so it could have been on some equipment, someone's clothes, anything, but it was definitely not intentional for stinknet.
Stinknet seems to be pretty new, something we haven't heard about until recently. How long has it been here, or at least has become a problem here?
It was first seen in Phoenix in 2005 and Tucson in 2015. It's really been within the last few years, I think, that it's been a concern here. It's still, most people I talk to at events haven't seen it, or they think they've seen it, but it's a lookalike because there's so many other little yellow flowers that pop up this time of year. But yeah, in Phoenix, it's so widespread, and it's just completely taken over Maricopa County, parts of it at least. So it's kind of a cautionary tale here like what Tucsonans are seeing in Phoenix. And, since it's only in the spring, only a couple months, it's like, boom, now's the time. Everybody's talking about it. Every person working in invasive species, like 90% of their emails are about stinknet these days. So, yeah, it's quite recent, and it's a tight window.
Since we are talking about stinknet, we'll use it as the example. But if you're out in one of the parks, or maybe even your own yard or neighborhood, and you see some stinknet or one of the other invasives, what should you do? Because I know sometimes you don't want to just pull it. That could actually help spread it. So what can the average person do?
Well, if you see stinknet in your yard, if it's a small amount, you can pull it out. Just use gloves, and very importantly, report it on stinknet.org, because stinknet is a little different than the others in that it's still possible to eradicate it here. With buffalo grass and fountain grass, we talk about management. Of course, we're not giving up, but it's about mitigating the risk. With stinknet, we still have a chance. So reporting it on stinknet.org allows the experts to track it. The people who are following doing outreach in certain areas where more stinknet is being seen, or treatments in those areas, every point on that map is really helpful. And it just takes a couple minutes. Send your location, send a photo, and it's reported. With buffalo grass and fountain grass, you can remove it, but you do need to be really careful about spreading the seeds. And the thing with those ones is the seeds stay in the soil for 3 to 5 years. So you have to come back and manage that area. It's not a one-time deal. Like, pull it out, I'm done. No, it's not that. You have to monitor it and try to disturb the soil as little as you can. But, pulling out a plant, you have to disturb it somewhat.
You mentioned fire earlier, and all the big three, if I guess that's what we want to call them, buffalo grass, fountain grass, and stinknet, all come from Africa and are part of a fire ecology. Here in the Sonoran Desert, we do not have a fire ecology. So is fire in any way beneficial in getting rid of these invasives, or does it's part of their life cycle?
Yeah, it's part of their life cycle. So yeah, people often ask, can I just burn it? But no, that's just too big of a risk. Buffalo grass, for example, burns at 1,600 degrees, which is about 3 times hotter than your typical native grass. That's insanely hot. It's enough to melt glass. Like buffalo grass, it's just the way it's in its DNA to burn that hot. So definitely, yeah, avoid fire at all costs with these guys.
And of course, as we've said, the focus is now on stinknet. It used to be buffalo grass was the headline. Now it's stinknet. I hate to ask this. What's the next one on the horizon? What are we worried about that as we started with StinkNet back in the 20 teens, what's the next thing?
Well, that's a good question, and it's hard to predict for sure. But the one that just first popped into my mind when you asked that is probably yellow-blue stem, and that has really been causing a lot of problems in Texas, and they're seeing it more here, particularly south of Tucson. And it's just similar characteristic. It's also a grass, and it can just take over. And most of the stuff I said about buffalo grass and fountain grass are true with that one. But it's even harder to remove because the roots go so far underground. That could be the next one, but time will tell. Well, us invasive folks are always trying to track these things before they make the news.
Exactly. Well, thanks for coming in and educating us for a few minutes.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was Ben Tully of the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. We've heard mention of the upcoming wildfire season throughout this week's episode. So what does a wet winter and spring mean for fires this summer, and how will invasive species impact it? That's where our conversation with Tom Dang began. He's a meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Tucson.
It's kind of a mixed signal. I mean, wet winters can be they can be beneficial, but they can also be kind of a challenge to forecast for the upcoming season. And so stepping back, we had our 15th wettest winter on record. The records go back to the 1890s, and the period is December through February. So it was a fairly wet winter, and we can attribute that to El Nino. We did go through an El Nino winter. So the recent rains and the relatively cool weather does help to delay fire weather season. I think in a lot of years in the past, we would probably be heading into fire season right now, and it just hasn't happened. I'm sure if you look around, you'll see all of the green and the grasses, and it's kind of remarkable for early April. That being said, things will dry out. We're not going to see much, if any, rain here for the next couple of months. So fire season is coming, and the mixed part about this is that with all of those rains, there certainly was a lot of grasses and those sorts of vegetation that forms. It's all going to cure out. So that is a lot of fuel for fires that if they do start, they could be potentially bad.
This is one of those weeks in Tucson where it was beautiful at the start of the week temperature-wise. By the time this goes to air, we're going to be up near the 90s. Now, those of us who live here know we've got a ways to go, but the heat is around the corner a couple of days from now. Does that help start up the fire season, or does the heat really have nothing to do with it at this time of year?
It does. I mean, it's a mixture of things that help to create those fire weather conditions. Heat and perhaps more importantly, the moisture levels. So as the relative humidities drop, that's where our vegetation really starts to dry out. And that temperature does play a role in that. Winds also play a role in that. Winds help to carry fires, but they also do help to dry things out and around here. And springtime is our windy season. So getting into April, May, early June, those are when we tend to get those stronger windstorms that we can often see here.
Coming into further and further into the spring, what do we see, especially coming out of an El Nino winter? Are we expecting a wetter late spring, maybe an earlier start to the monsoon? We might as well start thinking about it now. What does El Nino do, and because that plays so often into fire season?
It's such a great question, and fire season and the monsoon are definitely very connected. There's been a lot of research done here at the University of Arizona that looks into wintertime precipitation and how that impacts the monsoon. And there actually is a correlation, but perhaps not the best correlation that we want. As it turns out, wet winters do tend to lead toward drier monsoons. And there is a lot of reason, like scientific reason for that, but there does seem to be a correlation for that. On the other side of the bag, like drier winters do tend to lead toward wetter monsoons.
Let's talk about that. Everybody loves to talk about weather, but especially the monsoon here in southern Arizona, how all this plays.
It's an interesting thing. So I think most people have been to the beach before, and they're at least familiar with the idea of a land sea breeze. Part of the reason why it's comfortable out on the beach is because, well, the basic science is when you have differential heating. Like the sand heats up much quicker, much hotter than the ocean does. Like that's fairly basic science. What happens is that warmer sand, the air lifts. When that warm air rises over the sand, that cool ocean air comes in underneath, and that's where you get that nice cool ocean breeze. The monsoon, if you can think of it as just basically a very large scale land sea breeze, it's the intermountain west, the desert southwest that heats up during the summer. And when that heats up enough, you get that cool ocean air from the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of California that swoops in. That's what brings the moisture for the fuel for thunderstorms and the monsoon for us. But for that circulation to set up, the reason why wetter winters tend to lead to drier monsoons, wetter winters means snowier mountains. And a lot of the heat that you would normally see during that time of year, it just goes into melting the snow as opposed to heating the landmass. So basically, the more snow you have, the longer it takes to set up that circulation for the monsoon. All of that to say, our general outlook for this upcoming fire season and the monsoon is that there's a pretty good likelihood that it'll be a delayed start to the fire season, but potentially a delayed start to the monsoon as well. This fire season could go well into June, potentially into July. And that could potentially mean a lot of heat for us too.
And then you add in, as we heard earlier in the show, about invasive plants as they dry out, and there are more and more of them with that later start, it just compounds on itself on and on.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of certainly interconnected pieces here, and it's not a one-to-one correlation, right? Like we can't just say wetter winter means we're going to see this date start for the monsoon, or it's going to be this bad for fire weather. As we all kind of know, fires do tend to be human started. The vast majority of fires are started by humans and not by nature. So a lot of that is just dependent on, how conscientious humans are in terms of trying to control fire initiations. There's a lot of factors here that, we could certainly talk about for a long time.
Exactly. Well, we'll all find out together. Thanks for coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was fantastic to chat with you.
That was National Weather Service meteorologist Tom Dang. And that's the buzz for this week. Tune in next week when we look at historical markers around southern Arizona and what they do and don't tell us about our history. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer, and our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
AZPM's original productions are made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org.